Okay, we'll move to the next lecture, which is the main lecture of the day. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Graeme, the CEO of a company called FarmSafer from the UK. Graeme has a vast experience in pharmacovigilance and in the EU regulation. Graeme came all the way from Britain to speak to us, and this is his first visit to Israel, a short visit, but his first visit to Israel. Graeme, I would like to welcome you to Israel and invite you to give your talk, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to say that it's a pleasure to be with you all today, and thank you for inviting me over here and for listening to me in English as well. I will try to speak slowly so that you understand everything that I am saying. And thank you for the introduction as well. I have been involved in pharmacovigilance now and medical information for the last 20 years. So those of you on the front seats here, you can see what 20 years of pharmacovigilance has done to me. Okay? It's not a pretty sight. The one thing that has been evident to me over these 20 years in pharmacovigilance is the extent of the change that I've seen. So my PhD was actually in drug metabolism and pharmacokinetics, and when I was doing that 25 years ago, everything that was seen then was scientifically interesting. These days it's clinically relevant, and I think the concept that we had back then of one drug fits all has really moved apace around the world. And what I'd like to do today is just give you a little potted history of the things that have been happening in terms of pharmacovigilance that has shaped where we're at today and where I think we're going to be moving forward. So we'll have a look on the impact that it's had on a lot of companies. We'll talk about the various types of vigilance as well, because it's not just restricted to drugs. And we'll talk about from theory to reality, the actual doing, the practice of pharmacovigilance and how it's being tested in Europe especially. And I think this is the one thing that is of emphasis as far as I'm concerned. The only constant in life is change. We've seen so many changes in the regulations in that 20 years. I think somebody starting today in pharmacovigilance has got a real great task. For me, it was easy 20 years ago. There was virtually nothing to learn, and what you put in place was what you thought was best practice. Whereas today, that's far more legislated, and so a lot of your time is spent learning the legal aspects of safety as much as it is the scientific and medical facts. So even today, we're in a situation where there will be another product that will come off the market as a result of adverse reactions. What we're trying to do in pharmacovigilance is make it so that if it's got to come off the market, we can detect it early. We can make sure that the damage limitation is as little as possible and try and improve on the systems so that it doesn't happen again. And within pharmacovigilance, we are very much a public health department. That's what we're here to actually do, is protect public health. And so a lot of these examples I've given you are really to emphasize how things have developed over time, but the fact as well that as we've developed new systems and put things in place, so this is why the legislation keeps getting harder. So as a result of the adverse drug reactions, we started to see national regulations appear, organisations taking an international approach to safety analysis, such as the WHO, trying to organise unification of drug safety through international guidelines. And this is where ICH comes in, the International Conference on Harmonisation, and I'll mention those in a little while. And also, organisations developed to look at best practice approaches to drug safety as well. And this is CIOMS. So, when in 1967 the WHO said, we'll capture all these adverse reactions, The idea was that they could then alert regulatory agencies around the world if they saw a problem occurring with a drug. Who drug was developed as well, so that there was a dictionary available so that they could note down all the branded drug names as well, so that if there was an adverse reaction, they could associate it to the drug. Who art was developed to actually standardize some of the terms that were coming in. Because when people were reporting adverse reactions, there were no standard terms to use. And so Who art was developed to try and standardize some of the ways that people presented the adverse reaction reports. This has now been superseded by MEDRA. MEDRA is a way of coding adverse reactions into a format that makes it easy to understand and interpret, and also puts things into easily understood, what I call buckets, because they're all pointing to the same problem, the way that you code them. And coding them means that you actually get an accurate interpretation of what the reporter meant to say. They also started to work out definitions of, well, what is an ADR and what is a signal? So the WHO started with all of these things, and they've been taken further over time. So the WHO, their collaborating centre, currently it operates an international database. They've got over 5 million safety reports in there from around the world. So with that kind of number of cases in the database, and the collection is from over 85 countries around the world. So with that number of cases, that number of countries, that number of products, they can start doing some serious number crunching to work out, are we actually seeing adverse reactions occur with certain products, either at a class level or at an individual level, that are not in the current labelling of those products, and therefore should be. And they do these complex analyses to actually work out, using statistical programs, whether there's a higher association within the database of certain adverse reactions to certain drugs. So the WHO is working independently in the background. Each regulatory agency has the opportunity of going to the WHO and asking them, have you seen this? Have you seen that? And again, this is good because, like I said, the WHO has got no affinity with any particular company. They're totally independent, and they're there basically to provide information to regulatory agencies. All of their coding is currently done in Who art, naturally, because they developed it. The funny thing is that if we present them with a MEDRA term that's not in Who art, they add it to Who art. Which, if you think about it, over time means that, well, Who art will become MEDRA then, because you're putting the same things in. So even though it's still coded in Who art, that it does have an equivalent MEDRA term to it, so it will mean something to anybody when an adverse reaction report comes in. The WHO also established this other group, CIOMS, as well, the Council for International Organization of Medical Sciences. And they were formed in 1949. One of their primary functions was to act as a sounding board for any new developments in biology and medicine, and to explore social as well as ethical mechanisms for conducting clinical studies. And so they looked at the moral and legal implications as well as the ethical on conducting certain studies. Their role started to change a bit in 1977 when they said that CIOM should also act as a neutral forum for discussion on policy matters involving pharmaceutical companies and regulatory agencies. So basically, act a bit like a referee. So the regulatory authorities wanted something to happen in terms of drug safety. The pharmaceutical industry thought, well, that's going to be either difficult to implement, or if you did it this way, that would be better. And CIOMS was absorbing both sides of the argument and then coming up with a document. And so as a result of that, CIOMS now has really sort of established what was and is best practice. And the first thing that they came up was something that most people know about in pharmacovigilance, the CIOMS-1 form, this International Adverse Reaction Reporting form. Most countries around the world accept it. So if I have an adverse reaction in the UK and I need to report it to the USA, I will give it to them on a CIOMS-1 form. And the FDA will accept it because it's come from CIOMS. And a lot of countries around the world will do the same. What they then started to do was look at ways of coordinating international reporting for companies in other ways, and also using standard terms and methodologies. So CIOMS very much became, if you like, the thought leader on pharmacovigilance. And that resulted in a whole series of books that have been produced by CIOMS. And I've mentioned here, CIOMS-1 came out with this international ADR form. The next thing they turned around and said was, well, wouldn't it be good if that form was actually electronic? So you'd fill it in electronically and send it electronically. And out of that came CIOMS-1A. And a number of countries around the world now are accepting this form electronically. So in Europe, all 30 countries in Europe will accept this electronic ADR form. Switzerland, USA, Canada, Japan, other countries are also falling in line saying, well, this is easier. We don't need paper anymore. What we need is an international electronic form. We just press the button and off it goes to everybody. It saves time, saves money, saves transcription errors. So the idea of this has now been translated into legislation. The next thing that CIOMS came up with was, well, wouldn't it also be good if we actually periodically generated a safety report for the products? This then became translated in what we know as the Periodic Safety Update Report. But again, it was CIOMS that thought of it first. CIOMS is not legislation. Like I said, they're a think tank. So their idea is to come up with new ways of doing things. And if those new ways are good enough, they get incorporated. So just like here in Israel, you have PSURs, Europe we have PSURs, USA have PSURs, but it all started with CIOMS. CIOMS-3 came up then with the idea of, well, wouldn't it be good if you had one actual piece of information within the company regarding the adverse reactions you've received on your products that only contain those adverse reactions that you think your drug caused. So in other words, this became known as the company core safety information. And you only ever put in there what you thought your drug caused. And so it was a conservative document. Don't put it in unless you're sure. And that then drove all the labelling around the world for that product. So if you've got the product in 80 countries, you add something to the core safety information, it gets changed in 80 countries. This has now been adopted in European law, and it is on its way to being adopted in American law as well, as a concept. CIOMS-4 actually said, well, wouldn't it also be good if you're identifying these new reactions to actually have some formal system of doing a benefit risk assessment? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do. We have to work out the benefit and risk of our products. And so out of this, they came up with a booklet of doing benefit risk assessments. How to measure your drug in terms of the adverse reactions it causes. And this is going to vary by product, by indication, and by adverse reaction. And so CIOMS form came out with all of these ideas about how to measure benefit and risk. All of those ideas have been incorporated into the risk management plans that some of you may know exist within Europe, the risk evaluation and mitigation plans that exist in the US, all came out of CIOMS-4. The benefit risk assessments you do in your PSURs, CIOMS-4. Yeah? So you're starting to get the idea now of whatever CIOMS says, sooner or later it's going to end up in a piece of legislation. CIOMS then came out with practical ideas of how to do pharmacovigilance. And this was post-marketing safety, because companies at this time had been told to report adverse reactions, but hadn't been told how to collect the data, how to analyze the data, how to report the data, how to get follow-up information on that data. None of that had been documented anywhere. So this book came out in 1999 of practical ways of doing pharmacovigilance. Now this book, SEOMS 5, actually got on a bestseller list. Right? So you've now got a pharmacovigilance book on a bestseller list. Right? I don't know whether it beat 50 Shades of Grey, but for the first time people were obviously sitting up and listening to what was being said and required for pharmacovigilance. And that was an absolute first. Following quickly on from that, having given us ideas of how to do post-marketing safety, they followed it up with clinical safety, the best approaches to use when you're analysing clinical safety data as well. And again, this has been adopted in European legislation, US legislation, Canadian legislation, of how to. SEOMS also said, look, we're going to have to do signal detection. Not every company can afford the kind of database and the kind of computer programs that the WHO have got. So there's got to be simple ways of actually being able to look at the coding within Medra, pull some terms together and do some simple signal detection for those smaller companies, but it will still enable them to do proper signal detection and pick up problems early. So SEOMS actually worked here using the Pfizer database and came up with ways of saying, well, if I'm looking at QT prolongation for a drug, there are various other adverse reactions I should also be looking at. Ventricular fibrillation, torsade, cardiac death. So I'm going to pull all of these terms together, and then I'll look at each individual case and see whether those cases cumulatively are telling me the same problem. And so SMQs now are adopted as a standard methodology throughout Europe and the USA, especially comes up at inspections, when you get inspected, of how are you using your data to pick up signals early. And this has got into the legislation now. It's a requirement. You will conduct SMQs. Also, the next thing they came out with was DSURs, Developmental Safety Update Reports. Now, just like PSURs, the idea here is to do an annual report for your clinical trials. So they first came up with the idea of, well, wouldn't it be good if you only had one annual report for the drug, and that one annual report went to every regulatory agency everywhere, so that every agency is assessing the same data. Makes perfect sense. And out of this DSUR, DSUR, that has now been adopted in Europe, USA, Canada, Switzerland. So we've written now a number of DSURs. This came out about 2.5 years ago, and already it's now in legislation. Finally, SEOMS 8. Thank you. SEOMS 8 came out with how to conduct signal detection as well. So as well as providing us SMQs, which says, okay, put these together, it also gave the companies ideas of where and what type of data to use. Because it's not just individual cases that you should be looking at. You should be looking at study level as well. So if somebody's done a meta-analysis and it's appeared in the literature, how to interpret that data. If somebody's done a pharmacoepidemiological study and found an increase in risk. Now, an increase in risk isn't an adverse reaction. It's an increase that you might have an adverse reaction. Okay? But again, the idea here was to say, don't just put blinkers on and look at your cases. Open it out and start looking at studies that appear in the literature. They don't have to be company studies. They don't have to be at product level. They can be at class level. They don't have to be clinical studies. They could be preclinical. And it's the one thing I always tell a number of my clients who are generic companies. Look, when your drug got on the market, there was no requirement to do all of this. None whatsoever. And there is always some poor PhD student out there that's been given access to some rats and has given those rats your drug and has actually found out that it causes either cancers, causes embryo toxicity, causes whatever. As soon as that appears in the literature, you have to look and interpret, could that then happen in humans? Yeah? So the whole idea of this was to pull this information together so that companies have got an idea how to as well. Not just focus on individual cases, but look at the broad spectrum of data out there. ICH very much jumped on the bandwagon here. So this became a joint initiative between regulators and industries, the industry, in order to look at 3 specific areas for pharmaceutical development: safety, quality, and efficacy. And this only began in 1990. So pre-1990, most countries had their own rules, own requirements. Some were more stringent than others. Some were non-existent. But the whole concept of ICH was, we'll do it one way together. But it only formed in 1990. And again, the vast majority of those new drugs and medicines developed in Western Europe, Japan, USA, by the time that this was established, they were already on the market. So a lot of those products that have gone generic now have never been tested the way that is required today to get a license. Who's involved with this? Well, the European Union are involved in this. The EMA contribute to all the guidelines that come out from ICH. It began in 1990, as I said, and its idea was that once we've written these new guidelines, we can amend and revise them and look at new guidelines as befits new scientific areas, and they picked on gene therapy as being one of those new areas where the whole concept of drug safety changes. It's one thing to talk about dose responses and interactions. It's another thing to start talking about gene therapy and use of stem cells and things like this, advanced therapy products. Again, they regarded changes to the guidelines as being either major or minor. Most of these are minor revisions, but an expert group is set up each time to look at each area of ICH that needs to change. And like I said, the setting for it is such that this comprises both regulators and industry making decisions. So you've got the USA, Japan, as well as Europe taking part. You have the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industry Manufacturers. You've got the Japanese manufacturers here, and the US pharma, all involved in deciding these guidelines. So where does that leave us with these guidelines and the present legislation? Well, it leaves us in a situation where, for a number of the revisions, things have changed. In Europe, the present legislation, and we've had this legislation in place, especially with Volume 9, which became the Pharmacovigilance Bible, as far back as year 2000. So that was when Volume 9 made its appearance. It evolved into Volume 9A in March 2007. So Volume 9A was out there from 2007. But here we are 6 years later, and it's gone. Now, this document, if those of you know it, this document on pharmacovigilance covers 350 pages of pharmacovigilance. Right? It is the biggest single pharmacovigilance document around the world. To put it into context, there's a piece of legislation being debated at the moment in America that they call the Tome. And the tome means a very heavy, weighty document. Right? It, in comparison, is 90 pages long. So you've got this big, heavy document being debated in the US being 90 pages long, and the one in Europe being 350 pages long. Right? And it gives a measure of just how much has gone into the pharmacovigilance. And again, it's been strengthened and strengthened again because we're still seeing products come off the market due to safety reasons. And so we're strengthening the legislation to try and prevent this happening. There was a whole series of questions and answers associated with Volume 9A that came out after Volume 9A was introduced that were the law as well. They weren't just opportunities for you to look at and go, oh, that's how you do it. These were the law as well. So these documents also, as a result of the new legislation, have disappeared. Some old pieces of legislation still remain. So this one here was sufficiently vague enough that it talked about things that you needed to do but didn't put the detail with it. And because you didn't put the detail with it, the new legislation doesn't actually interfere with it, so it remains. But what's interesting in Europe is all pharmaceutical products have to go onto a database in Europe. It's the only region that has actually demanded every pharmaceutical company must put all of their products, both clinical trial and post-marketing, onto one database. And that way we can track you, your products, and your adverse reactions, and work out whether we think you're doing a good job or not. So this is the first time that an agency has been able to follow you without, if you like, getting out of their chair. I know how many products you've got in Europe. It's 98. I know which countries they're in. I know what the formulations are and the indications are. I know how many adverse reactions you've reported. Yeah? So the idea of this Article 57.2, this product dictionary database, is so that they can monitor you centrally. The other pieces of legislation down there, this one, talks about electronic reporting and the requirement that all companies in Europe must do electronic reporting. So paper doesn't exist in Europe anymore. You cannot report adverse reactions in paper. ICHE 2C, which was COMS 2, talks about periodic safety update reports. This document is undergoing revision at the moment. Originally launched in 1994, it received a major upgrade in 2003, and here we are 10 years later, it's now being totally revised. Totally revised. There were 10 sections for the PSUR before, there's now 20. Right? You had 60 days to write it up before, you've now got 70 days and 90 days to write it up. 70 days if it's a 6-month PSUR, 90 days if it's longer than a year. Now, you could say, oh, that's nice of the regulators, they're giving us extra time to actually write it up because they know we're understaffed and we need extra time to write it up. No, it's going to take you a lot longer to write those extra 10 sections. Before, the best way of looking at a PSUR before was it was a presentation document. Here you are, Mr. Regulator. This is what happened during this time period. Yeah? The new PSUR is an analysis document. Right? So you've gone from presenting the data to now providing them an analysis of the data. Now this is a big change. You now have to tell them, what signals are you looking at? Why haven't you put that in the label yet? Why did you add it to the label? Has it changed the benefit risk? Have you put a risk management plan in place to offset that risk? So this is an analysis document that is going to take a lot longer to write. Now, this old dog has been writing PSUR since 1995. So I'm going to have to learn some new tricks. Because this, to me, is a total change to how you used to write PSURs before. Anybody in the audience here written a PSUR before? Yeah? Well, one of the biggest sections within the PSUR was section 6, where you presented all the individual cases. Yeah? That's gone now. You don't do that anymore, because they don't want you to present the cases, they want you to analyse the cases. So it's become a pure analysis document where 50% of it is not going to be taken up with presenting all the cases that you reported or received, but an analysis of them. And this is again the regulators putting the emphasis on you to actually show me you're doing a thorough safety review of your products. Because obviously if you're writing one sentence in there, nothing's changed, then I want to know how you got to that conclusion. Show me your working out. Yeah? And this is a bit like those old maths problems that you used to have to do, where you had to used to follow a certain piece of logic, and then you would finish with QED, quod erat demonstrandum. Yeah? Easily described. Yeah? And that's what you're going to have to do with these new documents. And these documents are being adopted everywhere. So no longer presentation, but analysis, to show you do know what's going on with your products. And it doesn't matter whether they're generic or innovator. It's the same. If you get ahead of the innovator in identifying a signal with your generic product, your generic equivalent, good for you. But that is your responsibility to do that, not wait for the innovator to tell you. ICHE2D came out from that CIOMS 5 book, the bestseller, the one that got on the bestseller list, of how to do post-marketing safety, what we expect you to do for follow-up. And of course the emphasis is you get any serious unexpected adverse reaction, especially if the patient dies, you're expected to place most emphasis on getting that follow-up information. And it doesn't matter whether it's a healthcare professional or the patient themselves. You have to get that data. That is going to remain in place. That is what they're going to check when they come and see you as well. And again, like I've mentioned, this Article 57.2, you have to put your products on the product dictionary database. There is no choice. And this electronic reporting here, once you've put your product on the product dictionary database, it's given a code. You put that code into your electronic report, so it can always tie up the adverse reaction and your product. You don't put the code in from here, you don't get the report accepted. So you have to put your products on there. Also, post-marketing, risk management plans. In Europe, this has been adopted, it's been in place for some time. 10 years ago in pharmacovigilance, all you had to do was work out risk and benefit. And has it changed? Now that's not good enough. If the risk has increased, what can you do to reverse the risk? So this is where risk management plans come in, risk minimization comes in. You've got to come up with a proposal to restore the benefit by reducing the risk. The electronic reporting still remains and will be developed as time goes on, so that you can actually attach things to the report. X-rays, lab data, literature articles, all of these are being developed now. In Europe, as most countries, we have privacy laws about how you can transmit data, what data you're allowed to collect, what data you're allowed to share with other people. And that remains intact as well. We have various guidances in Europe about capturing pregnancy data and signal detection. They remain in place. You can always add national regulations on top of any European legislation. So let's say, for example, we had to report something in 15 calendar days. A country could turn around and say, well, our national regulations say 14. And they can do that. What they can't say is 16. So you can never go below what European law says, but you can always go higher. Thankfully, with the new legislation that has come into place that I'm going to talk about, no one has turned around and said, actually, we can do more. And that has to be a first. So that, to me, shows that the new regulations have just about reached everybody's limit in terms of what they can do, right? Because we've got no individual agency actually saying, I'm better than the rest and I can do more. From the clinical side as well, the Clinical Trials Directive also has this requirement to put your clinical trial products on the dictionary database. All the guidance notes are captured in volume 10. So just as we had volume 9A, these are captured in volume 10. And these ICH documents on how to report adverse reactions, how to conduct good clinical practice for your clinical trials, and how to write the DSUR, this Developmental Safety Update report, all are being retained in the new legislation. What is clear, though, under the new legislation, which came in after June 2012, is they've gone for a modular format of how to describe pharmacovigilance. Now, this modular format is such that there were going to be 16 modules of pharmacovigilance. Now, you can already see that I've crossed 16 out and put 15 down. That's because they had a rethink and they absorbed one of the modules into another module. So it's no longer 16 modules of pharmacovigilance, but 15. Each of these modules are law. Okay, so the law itself within Europe, the 2010-84, tells you there are certain things they expect of you. The modules explain what to do and how to do it. So the first 7 batches came out in June. The full set of all of these is scheduled to appear in February 2013, and the latest guidance is that they should be complete by Q4 this year. But as each new module comes out, you have to adapt and change. What do they look like? Well, as you can see down here, and I'm going to explain this in a little while on another slide, but you can see the first thing they talked about was quality. And I don't think it's any excuse at all that quality is the first module. There is the old adage, if you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. Yeah? And so it's no good to actually submit things that are inaccurate. If you submit things that are inaccurate to the agency, they're going to make inaccurate determinations. So the first thing they want to see within pharmacovigilance is quality. Then they want you to tell them, how do you do your pharmacovigilance? So this is a document that describes how you, as a company, fulfill the legislation. How you report your adverse reactions, the new PSURs, how you conduct safety studies, and how they work within the various member states. By member state, I mean country. How you do your signal management. They do provide something on definitions, which is really useful. I think within pharmacovigilance and within regulations, this is the worst industry possible for abbreviations and acronyms. Okay? So they've provided us with a definitions document. And the definitions document is something that is important because for the first time, it's actually given us a regulatory definition of what is an overdose. Pre this new legislation, there was no regulatory definition of an overdose. So companies used to make it up. Yeah? Well, an overdose is where the doctor has prescribed anything above what's in the labelling. That was one interpretation. Another interpretation was, well, an overdose is anything above what the doctor prescribed, irrespective of what's in the labelling. So it might say 40 milligrams in the SPC, but the doctor has actively prescribed 60 milligrams because he thinks the patient needs 60 milligrams. Yeah? So now we have actual definitions for all of these. Drug abuse, misuse, Yeah? Overdose, medication error. All of these are now well defined in the legislation. Again, audits, auditing your system. How do you know it's working? You would never drive a car for 10 years without servicing it. So why would you not audit your pharmacovigilance system to make sure it's functioning as you expect? Because if you don't service your car for 10 years, you know what's going to happen to it. It will break down one day and it won't start again. So the whole idea of an audit is to make sure you're doing what you think you're doing. The inspection is there to actually check you've done your audit and it is performing properly. And the idea of inspections in Europe now is such that the expectation for you to actually pass an inspection carries with it very serious fines if you don't. And I'll describe some of those in a few minutes. There are still more expected. There are certain products, including generic products, that will require additional monitoring because they have known safety issues with them. So these will be innovator products coming to the market and generic products with known safety issues. The public participating in pharmacovigilance. Now this may seem very scary, but what they mean here is they want the public to be far more involved in telling you about the problems that they've had on your products. And no longer is there going to be a reliance on the healthcare professional telling you. Continuous benefit risk assessment of your products. This is your safety reviews. Are you actually conducting active safety review and monitoring your products? Incident management. This has actually been absorbed, this one is. Incident management is where you actually get some kind of crisis with your product. Some safety crisis. And you're going to have to take action with your product. International cooperation. Again, I like the fact that it says to be confirmed. When it says to be confirmed, it doesn't mean do we actually share the information, it means how. So anything that gets picked up in Europe will get transmitted globally with a product. So they'll tell the USA, they'll tell Canada, they'll tell Israel, they'll tell Switzerland that we've identified an issue with a product in Europe. Here's the data. You've got it in your country. What do you think? Yeah. Safety communication. How do you communicate safety changes? Well, if it's a contraindication, you don't just put it in your label. You need to actually send out dear doctor letters. There may be a bulletin that needs to go out in certain journals to advise. You know, if it's a loss of an indication with a product, again, you can't just take it out and assume people will read it. So this is the measures you're going to take on how to communicate safety. And then risk minimization and management. And you've got to test to make sure it's working. So anything you've implemented to reduce the risk, is it working? So you look at all of these aspects and you start seeing that, well, actually, yes, there's a lot in here that's going to be coming out that is going to cause change. The changes are such that I think they fit into 5 different buckets. The first one is quality. What's actually happening in Europe at the moment is, and this is happening for every company in Europe, the EMA have hired a company whose only job it is to look at the data you've provided as a company, your individual cases. So that electronic ADR you've submitted, first of all, it has to be in a certain format, otherwise it will get rejected. Now, I've said this in other lectures, just because it's been accepted doesn't mean it's accurate. It means it filled the boxes it needed to, but it could still be inaccurate. So for the dose of a product that should be 40 milligrams, if you've put 4 grams in there, the machine can't pick that up. The machine doesn't know that 4 grams is incorrect. But these people, when they're going through your report, will know, well, there's no way the patient should be taking 4 grams a day. It's 40 milligrams a day. You give them 4 grams a day, they're going to be dead. Yeah? They will look at the narrative you put together. If you mention medical history in the narrative, but don't mention it in the drop-down fields and code it, that's an error. You report it late, that's an error. You don't put the concomitant medication in the drop-down fields, that's an error. Why? Because signal detection is done on drop-down fields, not on narrative. Yeah? You mention adverse events in the narrative that you don't code and you don't store, that's an error. Now, how many errors do you think they're allowing you to make per case? Right? Because we're all human, we make mistakes. So how many errors are you allowed to make per case? 1, 0, 1, 1. You're allowed to make 1 error. So if you submit it late on day 16, there's your error. You're not allowed to go higher. I've seen some reports that have come through already, just to put it into context. And like I say, this is all about quality, right? There was one company, they had 50 reports analysed. It was a major pharmaceutical company, 50 reports analysed. How many errors? Bearing in mind you're allowed to make 1 error per case, so we're hoping it's under 50, aren't we? Okay? So how many errors? 40, 500. Who said 500? Yeah. Where's that cynical person that said 500? It was actually 370. Now the reports had been accepted into the database, but they obviously weren't quality. So what's missing from the company is that quality check to make sure what I've given to you is accurate. Yeah? What I've given to you is complete. And this is what the EMA are most concerned about, is, well, if you're giving me rubbish information, I'm going to get rubbish results. So you're asking me to do signal detection, analyse your products, do this, do that. You give me the wrong information, I can't do that. If you haven't got quality in your company, and this company is picking it up, then maybe I need to pay you a visit. Yeah? And this is where the inspections come in. Because if you don't get the quality right up here, yeah, then I need to come and see you. Your pharmacovigilance systems master file basically explains how you as a company do pharmacovigilance. So built into this document has to be a quality section. For the first time, and you companies that have medical devices will know this because you've had this in place for years. But for the first time, in Module 1, it actually talks about companies needing to have an ISO standard for pharmacovigilance. Now, medical devices have had ISO standards for years, but this is the first time they want to see an ISO standard applied to your pharmacovigilance activities. So quality, everything starts from there. The inspections and the audits for you are your measure of quality. Are we doing it right? Who's making the errors? Is the error not due to human error as such, but because the training is not good enough, or because the way that the document is presented is ambiguous and it makes it difficult to get it right? Yeah? I will give you some scary examples as well, because I did mention this. They also want to assess, are you making the correct determination of what is a serious adverse reaction and a non-serious adverse reaction? Well, if I tell you that in one inspection that happened very recently for a company, the company had decided that gastrointestinal bleeding was non-serious, myocardial infarction was non-serious, and pancreatitis was non-serious, and had submitted the reports as such, then you get an idea that they are not very happy with the level of quality that's coming to them. Because if you're assessing those as being non-serious, you're downgrading the risk with your products. Yeah? And bear in mind as well, that had gone through at least 3 people: the data entry person, the data reviewer, and the medical reviewer. And that happened on more than one occasion. And I was there with the client when they were saying, and this, and this. And the client just had to say, I'm guilty, because there was no excuse. But that's why they're putting so much emphasis on the quality. Then we've got the reporting. How to actually report your adverse reactions, and I'll finish with a few slides of that. Assessment. We have a signal management module that tells us how to do this, and benefit risk. You cannot identify a new signal without doing a benefit risk assessment. So you identify a new adverse reaction associated with your drug, you have to do a benefit risk assessment. This is a new adverse reaction, I'm going to put it into my labeling. Where does this leave the benefit risk now? Yeah? And both of those have to take place in your safety review. Both of those will go into your PSUR. How did you assess that? How did you work that out? The outputs, what the regulators are going to see, the PSURs, the incident management, the safety communication aspect about how are you going to communicate anything that you've picked up here as well, and also any referral procedures for safety reasons. What you have to do in Europe is react quickly. You're going to contraindicate something, you can't take 60 days to do a license variation. You have to fast track it. So the idea is you will triage your label amendments according to the level of risk you've seen. And again, everything comes back down to risk. So you've got outputs coming from this, so reporting it, assessing it, and the output from it. Then, on top of that, you've got the investigations bit. Now, investigations are the what don't I know about my product yet? And it could be that you've got a risk management system in place because you've identified something and you want to know, can I reduce the level of risk? And so I'll put this procedure in place to reduce that risk. You've got a study that's been set up, a post-authorization safety study here, because you need to understand, well, what is the extent of the risk? How many patients do I think are affected? What's the frequency of something? The additional monitoring could be that I've identified certain signals, I'm not sure they're true. But when they do occur, there may be special adverse reaction forms or special pieces of information I need to collect. The public participation here, again, the public can participate in some of this, providing data as well. And then finally, over here, you've got the tools that you're using to actually manage these risk management. You've got to demonstrate they're working. That information, again, is going to appear in your PSUR. So you're analysing everything, assessing everything, monitoring everything to make sure that as far as the regulators are concerned, anything that's coming through, above everything, quality. Quality has to be in place. Now, we've had various adverse reaction reporting in Europe that up until this time has been very conservative. If it wasn't qualified by a healthcare professional, it wasn't going to be reported. So we needed a healthcare professional to tell us. If they told us, they gave us the minimum information, we can report it. Well, Europe has now decided that that's no longer going to be good enough. We get too few reports and we want to increase the level of reporting. So, now, the new system of pharmacovigilance in Europe is I want everything from healthcare professionals and patients. And not only that, I also want the non-serious cases. And this goes far beyond any other region in the world. So all those serious cases that occur in the EU, all those non-serious cases that occur in the EU, I want them. And I want to put them in my database. Now, I've actually done an assessment with 2 major pharma companies on this to see what level of impact the new legislation is going to have on companies. And the 2 companies concerned, obviously I can't name them, but out of that, there was a 27% increase in resourcing in one and 32% increase in another. So in other words, if you had 10 people in pharmacovigilance before, you need 13 now. Because again, the additional requirements of what to do mean that you're going to have to spend longer doing it. The non-serious cases get reported in 90 days as well. So again, there is a timeline for the non-serious. Now, if I was a regulator, and I am an auditor, so don't shoot me, but I am an auditor, the first thing that comes to mind as far as I'm concerned is if you're giving me now your non-serious cases, I can easily work out, have you assessed them properly or not? Have you assessed them properly or not? Because I can now see that if you've given me pancreatitis and put it down as non-serious, I've got it. So I can see you're assessing them wrongly. Yeah? And that's my first trigger to come and pay you a visit. Yeah? Add on to that, again in Europe, we have this very simple habit that although we have European legislation, national legislation can actually demand something above. So here in Europe, for example, we have 3 ways of actually getting a license. Now the good news is they said, look, we don't care how you got a license now, you report it. We don't even want you to work out is it unexpected or expected, we want you to report it. So you get any serious cases, non-serious cases, tell us. Simple. But as is usual in these situations, some member states want to receive the reports directly. They don't want them to go to the EMA, and then the EMA tell them. Even though there is, at best, only a 2-second delay. Because you're sending these things electronically. So if it goes into the EMA database, 2 seconds later, it goes to the UK. Right? But still the UK have insisted, I want it first, please. Yeah? So when you're looking at reporting and compliance, you can't just send it into Europe at the moment. You have to look at the various countries in Europe and who wants it delivered to them directly and who wants it to just go to the EMA. The EMA were really frustrated with countries turning around and doing this. So they've actually set a deadline now of 2015 where they've said by 2015 we want it only to go to the EMA. We don't want any of this country reporting anymore. But as it stands at the moment, we do have a situation where some of the countries want it directly and the UK's no better. So they're down there saying, yes, I want those before you give them to the EMA. Denmark's done the same. And you can see up here there's 6 other countries here that do want the non-serious cases given to them directly rather than just submitting them to the EMA. So in Europe we still have a slightly fractured reporting system. And there's more. So if this doesn't give you nightmares about what's going on, we've got other aspects that we're going to contend with very soon. So in drug safety, we're going to see more international adoption. So ICH will become the standard. And there are countries developing new pieces of legislation almost on a daily basis, which means countries where you had to do no reporting before, all of a sudden, there's a whole complete new set of legislation that's appeared overnight. Vaccine safety. There's new standards being developed for vaccines as well, because vaccine safety is very different to drug safety. You add on top of this device safety. Now device safety, or incidents as they're called as opposed to adverse reactions, has always been operated on a national basis. But now they're talking of developing international standards for medical devices, and rightly so. The medical device industry is a huge and growing industry, and it's about time we did have international adoption of standards. At this moment in time, when I look at medical devices in Europe and I look at medical devices in the US, we have different categories of medical device and class of medical device. So you have to remember, is mine a 2A in Europe or is it a 3 in America? Because that can influence the kinds of reports that you generate as well. As well down here, mainly for the ladies, I have to admit, I am not wearing makeup, but as of 2013, cosmetovigilance is actually gaining an international standard. Just to put this into context as well about cosmetovigilance, I actually visited a cosmetics company. I was invited to go and actually speak to them about cosmetovigilance because they knew the new legislation was coming in. And there are national regulations appearing almost on a daily basis for cosmetovigilance, cosmetics. This particular company actually gets 3 million adverse reaction reports a year on its cosmetics. Now, to put that in context, that is 10 times Pfizer as the #1 company in the world. I'll say that again. 3 million ADR reports a year for their cosmetic products. 10 times more than Pfizer report in a year. Right? So for the cosmetics industry, and actually the cosmetic side of things, this is a massive, massive change that's going to take place in terms of cosmetovigilance and the need to report. And there's going to be GMP issues that go with it as well. What made it even funnier when they told me about this was that when I asked what infrastructure they've got at present to monitor this, they have one physician. Right? I just imagine that one physician being chained in the office and not allowed to leave, have holiday, right? Because 3 million reports a year. And then they said, oh, but that doesn't include all of our companies. That just includes what happens in America. So they're getting 3 million reports a year from America alone. And they are a global company. What's also happening in terms of legislation and moving forward is the advanced therapies. I've mentioned these earlier, the gene therapies, stem cells, etc., etc. This is a whole new area of pharmacovigilance that has yet to be written. The kind of adverse reactions that you're going to get with these are totally different. Let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, we were able to develop a stem cell that would reverse the effects of Parkinson's disease. So now we've been able to reverse the effects of Parkinson's disease. But there are a number of things we don't know about these cells. What if they die after a year? Do we have to keep re-injecting? Would they work as well the second time, the third time, the fourth time? What if they migrate to other areas of the body? They don't stay at the base of the brain where we've injected them. What if they carry on growing? They don't stop growing. And what if, after 7, 8, 9 years, they turn into cancer cells? Yeah? And migrate to different areas of the body. So the whole concept with advanced therapy is yet to be written. But it is something, again, we're going to see over the next 5 and 10 years develop. So there'll be different areas of pharmacovigilance requiring different skill sets as we progress over time. All of these are being written at ICH level, European level, national level as we speak. Yeah? I want to finish at this point. I've used my allotted time, I think. But I want to thank you for your attention this afternoon. I hope you found what I've been talking about interesting, and I'll take any questions.
Graeme, just to finish in a more happier note, would you mind elaborating a little bit on the EU new regulation, especially on the exemption list of PSURs?
Yes. With PSURs, there's three things actually going on in Europe with regards to periodic safety update reports. One is unifying the birth dates. So if you've got amoxicillin, the amoxicillin PSUR will be written on a certain date, irrespective of when you got your license. That date will be given to you. It will be a European birth date, which means that all amoxicillin PSURs will arrive at the regulators on the same day. The second thing that's happening in Europe is they're assigning one country to look after one active ingredient. So for amoxicillin, that might be Austria. So all the PSURs for amoxicillin are going to arrive at the Austrian regulatory agency on the same day, and it is their job to assess amoxicillin. Yeah? The third thing that's happening is they're looking at this whole list of active ingredients and basically saying to themselves, look, there's been no new safety issues with this product for the last 10 years. Do we actually need a PSUR that tells us nothing? And so they're providing an exemption list as we speak. If they don't name your product, your active ingredient, on the exemption list, you have to produce one. And this is another true story. When it was first announced that generic products may not require PSURs, there was a big generics company that virtually fired all its PSUR department, thinking, great, I don't have to do them anymore. Yeah? And then obviously when it became apparent that, well, actually, no, it'll only be a small percentage, it was like, come back. We didn't mean it. Yeah? And I'm not joking when I say that. But they've been very conservative with the first pass. Obviously what they want to do is get to a situation where, say, the Austrian authorities looking at amoxicillin can turn around and go, you know what, there are no safety issues with this, and I'm going to recommend that we don't need any more amoxicillin PSURs. So this list will constantly change and grow. If, while doing signal detection, they do find a new safety issue with a product that has been taken off the PSUR list, they can bring it back on because they found a safety issue. Now, this is incredibly logical thinking as far as I'm concerned, because now, if I'm the Austrian authority, I get all 15 licenses for amoxicillin. I can compare all their labels. I can make sure all their labels match each other, so they contain exactly the same information. Yeah? And I can make a benefit risk assessment on amoxicillin as an active ingredient and make a recommendation. I don't need to see this again. Yeah? Because then I can focus my time on the products where I do need to spend more time. Yeah? And so this list has started small. It will get bigger. What's the downside of all of this? It only applies to Europe. So if you've got your products in Turkey, you've got your products in the USA, Canada, you still have to write your PSURs. So if Austria said you don't have to write amoxicillin anymore, fine, you don't have to write it for Europe, but you still have to write it for the USA, Canada, and everybody else.
Any questions?
My question is regarding reporting of adverse reactions of generics. I would like, most of adverse reactions are reported in Israel anyway by physicians, and they are not aware if the adverse reaction is related to a branded drug or generic drug. So I would like to know if Europe or anywhere else thought about mechanism of distinguishing between adverse reactions related to the generic or branded. For example, in the recently in the FDA, the FDA withdraw Teva's generic Wellbutrin, which is generic drug. And I was just wondering if it could happen anywhere else, because in Israel I cannot see this situation, to distinguish between two drugs. And
yes, and I think that's where that product dictionary database comes in that I mentioned. So if there was for example, a Teva product in Europe, a generic, and there was a Mylan equivalent generic in Europe, if they saw disproportionate number of reactions being assigned to the Teva generic as opposed to the Mylan generic, they would then investigate further. And I think this is why, like I said, they want to follow both active ingredient to see whether there's adverse reactions that should be in all of the generic products, or whether there's something peculiar because it's a different salt, it's a different ester, it's this, between the various generics to actually say, well, actually, there's more occurring with this particular generic than another generic, and we want to find out why. And that's why they've asked companies to actually put their products onto this product dictionary database. The other reason they've done it, and it's the more cynical reason, is if Teva is reporting all these adverse reactions, but there's none coming from any other company, that equally looks suspicious. Because that means basically that either there is a problem with the Teva product, or you're not reporting adverse reactions. Yeah?
Hi, you hear me? I'm Vivian Ben David from Cato Research in Israel. It's interesting because in the UK, levothyroxine has been a generic for many years. And recently across the world, when Eltroxin, when the license was bought by Aspen, and they changed the formulation, not the active ingredient at all, there was a whole swathe of adverse reactions across the world. So I'm struggling to see the benefits of exemptions to generics, because the adverse reaction reporting would get lost for those kind of drugs.
I think yes and no. When you're looking at a sudden surge of adverse reactions associated with a product, the immediate question is why? Eltroxin had been out there for years. Yeah. So when you're looking at the level of adverse reactions, they'd been stable over those years. All of a sudden you get a spike. And what you're going to do, if you've got any sense at all, is look at, okay, what changed? Is this batch related? Well, no, it seems to be every batch. So what else changed? And if it was a formulation change, then you've got to look at, well, what specifically in the formulation change could have done that? You add to the fact that with thyroxine, like digoxin, like warfarin, these are very narrow therapeutic margins. So you know again that any kind of formulation change with a product that's got a narrow therapeutic margin could cause these kind of reactions to occur. And for that reason, you would pick it up as a spike.
Okay, did it also include those types of products on the exemption list?
Sorry?
Would they also include those types of products on the exemption list where they've got a narrow therapeutic window?
Well, when you say the exemptions list, which exemptions list?
For PSURs?
No.
They won't be included?
No, yeah.
Okay.
They'll never include those kind of products. There are some decisions that were made in Europe regarding certain products not requiring PSURs that I strongly disagree with. The first one they said is that we don't want PSURs for herbal products anymore. Now, I've worked with herbal products for the last 10 years, and black cohosh, for example, is a product that should always have a PSUR written for it. You've got echinacea, you've got valerian, you've got loads out there that St. John's wort, that absolutely these should have PSURs written for them, because the benefit-risk profile is something that will remain under investigation forever. But they took a decision, no to herbals, no to homeopathics. So those are exempted per se. That's why I think they've been conservative with the initial list that's come out of the exemptions for the so-called old, well-established medicinal products, is because we've never had a single assessment done before of the active ingredients by one member state. It meant that the information was always sort of dispersed. Whereas now we've collated it all and we can make simple decisions. Now, Austria by itself cannot make a decision to ban amoxicillin. Because, and I think the previous person here said the same thing, is that there is a committee that sits above in Europe now called the PRAC, the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee. So if I'm Austria and I make any decision about amoxicillin at all, I have to pass it up to them. And if they agree with my deliberation, then it will happen for the whole of Europe. But so there's always a safeguard there to make sure that those kind of things won't happen. Yeah?
You mentioned that the WHO is collecting information from 85 countries and is having its own signal detection process. I was wondering if you can elaborate on that, if they are a significant contributor to the major pharmaceutical companies of signal detection that they haven't been able to identify themselves.
That's a very good question. The WHO's immediate contact is to regulatory agencies, not the pharmaceutical industry. Yes. Not all over the world. Those that have subscribed to them, so those 85 countries, they're the ones that they have a direct rapport with. And what can happen there, and it certainly happens in Europe, is if an agency receives a serious unexpected adverse reaction, they can go to the WHO and say, have you seen this anywhere else in the world? And if they say, well, actually, we've got 5 or 6 cases of this, then it gives that agency the opportunity to go back to the license holder and say, can you investigate this a bit more, please? So they're in the background, because I've had requests come from an agency and I'm thinking, I have no idea where this has come from. You know, I've not seen a report on it or I've not seen anything, but you know full well that's the WHO whispering in the ear of the regulators and basically saying, I think there's a problem here, can you go and have a word with the license holder? Now, the other thing that the WHO do as well is you can buy adverse reaction data from them. So if you ever wanted, and I've done this as an exercise, okay? If you ever wanted to find out what the WHO have got on your product versus what you've got on your product, you'll be in for a surprise. Because in Europe, there is a requirement for the agency, if they get a direct report, to tell you as the license holder. Not every regulatory agency does that, which means that they've probably got 30% more adverse reactions on their database on your drug than you've got on your own database. Because, like I said, the countries in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, there's no requirement for them to actually tell the license holder, but they'll give the data to the WHO. And so there's lots of adverse reactions out there, and I found it was nearly 40%. There were 40% more adverse reactions on the WHO ADR database than in my own database for my product. So the WHO do have this very sort of like big responsibility and opportunity to communicate potential signals at an early stage.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll go out on a break now. Thank you very much, Graeme.